Hello everybody! Before we begin, I would like to let you all know that I have a book out. It is called Not Quite Dead, and it is the story of a woman whose fiancé passed away a year ago, having dreams where he tells her that he's still alive and trying to use said dreams to get him back. It is available on Amazon in both paperback and ebook formats, so if you've ever wanted to support me financially, then this is your opportunity to do so. Link is in the description. Hey gang, it's Squill, and this is a video I've wanted to make for a very long time now. Not only is Betty Grof one of my favorite characters in Adventure Time, with probably my favorite arc across the original series, but her character journey and relationship with Simon was also direct inspiration for my first novel, Not Quite Dead. And on top of that, Betty was also the subject of my first ever Adventure Time analysis video, all the way back in 2019 if you'll believe it or not. Please don't watch that video, I was 16 when I made it, it's probably bad. But on top of that, with Betty having a prominent role in the first season of Fiona and Cake, that video is now outdated. So now that her character journey is presumably complete, let's take a retrospective look back at Betty's entire character arc on Adventure Time. The first appearance of Betty Grof technically happens in Season 3's Holly Jolly Secrets, in which she appears on a photo in Simon's tape. All we really learn about her here is that she's Simon's fiancé, she ran off after he put the crown on, and that he's never seen her again. This obviously isn't enough to give her any actual characterization, but it does leave room for a lot of speculation. What type of person was Betty like, and where did she go when she ran away from Simon? Betty just barely appears pictured one more time in Season 4's I Remember You. All we really learn here is that Betty was present when Simon found the Enchiridion. Now, as we all know, Betty doesn't get her first canon speaking role until her titular episode near the end of Season 5. But technically speaking, her first speaking role in any piece of official Adventure Time media is volumes 18 and 19 of the Adventure Time comic run. I actually talked about this one for a bit in my top 10 Adventure Time comic stories, so I'm gonna try not to repeat myself here. But basically, she ends up just being a hallucination created by the Lick. And as such, she isn't really given much in the way of characterization here, outside of making out with Simon. I mostly just find it fascinating that she was used here at all, before she was even a real character in the main show. But speaking of which, let's discuss Betty's debut episode. An episode that will start a character arc that will span across the entire rest of the franchise. Now, despite the episode being titled after her, Betty doesn't actually appear until around halfway through the story. There's a lot going on in this episode, and as such, it is commonly criticized for its pacing, with many wishing this episode was a two-parter, giving what should be big story beats more time to breathe. I actually had the idea a while back that the first half of this episode would be titled Simon, and primarily focus on his interactions with Marcy, Finn, and Jake as they build the machine to help him contact Betty. And then the second half would be called Betty, and focus on her trying to save Simon. Of course, now we actually have an episode named after Simon, but I still think it's a good idea. For an episode titled after her, we just don't spend enough time with Betty, especially considering she won't appear again for over 40 episodes. However, my dear viewer, there is an upside to the quick pacing of this episode. Because in retrospect, just how fast the events of the second half of this episode play out kind of add a bit to Betty's characterization. In a matter of seconds, Betty dropped everything she had in her old life, got quickly adjusted to the fantastical world of Ooh, and found a way to fix the crown all for the sake of Simon. Which isn't to say that the speed at which Betty makes her decisions couldn't be felt in a double-length episode, just probably to a lesser degree. But the ironic thing about what Betty does in this episode is that it's ultimately what hurts Simon in the long run. Because Simon spent 1,000 years without Betty, thinking that she abandoned him, with the only person there to comfort him being a child. With his obsession with finding Betty eventually manifesting in his desire to kidnap princesses. Now, obviously, we don't know what would have happened had Betty stayed with Simon. It is entirely possible that they could have found a way to reverse the crown's effects. But it's also possible that Betty just being there would have lessened the effect the crown had on Simon, as it would have removed the obsession that Simon had with trying to find Betty, which obviously contributed into his spiral into madness. One last thing to note about this episode before we move on is that there is a little bit of a contradiction between what we see here and what we hear from Simon in Holly Jolly Secrets. In the former episode, Simon says that Betty left him after he took the crown off, whereas in Betty's episode, we see that Simon clearly still has the crown on when she leaves him. This is probably just a continuity error, but you could also see it as an early sign of the crown messing with Simon's memory, him misremembering the order of events here. As I mentioned before, it unfortunately takes the show a fairly long time to follow up on Betty's storyline after this episode, with her next major appearance not being until near the end of season 6 in You Forgot Your Floaties, with her only appearance in between these two episodes being a brief non-speaking cameo in Jake the Brick, in which we see her studying MMS. And we do see that her arc has progressed in a lot of ways in between her first two episodes. We learn here that Betty has been working with Magic Man, and that she has been studying the effects of magic, madness, and sadness. Really wish we got more of this Betty and Magic Man team up. I feel like they could have gotten at least another episode or two before this one. And we could have had a full episode of Betty talking to and learning from various wizard characters. Because as is, it sort of just feels like we have this big awkward gap in Betty's arc. And while You Forgot Your Floaties is a great episode, it does feel more like a Magic Man episode than a Betty episode. Betty is more or less just used as a vehicle here for us to get a glimpse at Magic Man's past, with the biggest development on Betty's side of the story being her gaining Magic Man's magic, madness, and sadness. Which, don't get me wrong, is a pretty big development, and we'll talk more about it later. I guess I just wish this episode was a bit more Betty-focused as a whole. Thankfully, the gap between this episode and Betty's next major appearance is a little bit shorter. However, calling this a major appearance for Betty is maybe a bit of a stretch. In Kane's Ransom, Betty steals the Ice King's crown alongside Gunter and attempts to reprogram it. What results in this is a very fun Finn, Jake, and Ice King adventure, but not a particularly great Betty episode, as she gets less than a minute of screen time total, and for some baffling reason, is voiced by Tom Herpich. Like, I get why they disguised her voice earlier in the episode, so as to not spoil the reveal, but why is he still voicing her after the reveal? Why is she still using the voice modifier? Ice King can see her. Could they not get Lena Dunham to do this one line? Considering they got her back and broke his crown, which is only 6 episodes later and a part of the same production season, I find that hard to believe. Anyways, weird decisions aside, it's worth noting that this is actually the first time Betty has ever interacted with Ice King. And that Ice King is just as enamored with her as Simon was, which is very sweet. Betty leaves Ice King with his crown, but it's clearly been tampered with. This plot point is followed up on a few episodes later in Broke His Crown, where Ice King starts acting crazier than normal due to Betty messing with his crown. As it turns out, Betty implanted a virus in the crown to try to reprogram it to bring back Simon. The Betty virus in this episode isn't the same consciousness as our Betty, however it does hold her memories. And in fact, Simon is only able to get through to Betty by bringing up a memory he has of her leaving him a note in the library. A note that will certainly come up again later on in this video. I think the most interesting thing about this version of Simon and Betty to me is that this is the only version of them that we know of that get a happy ending. At least for this episode. Due to the crown being reset and Come Along With Me, it is entirely possible, if not most likely, that this version of Simon and Betty no longer exists. But they at least got to die together, I guess. Otherwise, not a ton to say about Betty's role in this episode, especially considering it's not even the real her. So let's take a bit of a break here and discuss Betty's story so far. As y'all can probably tell, it's kind of a mixed bag. I really love a lot of what they're doing with her on paper, but execution-wise, it could be better. I think the biggest issue with Betty's arc so far is simply her lack of screen time. She only gets 4 major-ish appearances across seasons 5 through 8, and all 4 of them have their caveats. She only appears about halfway through her debut episode. You Forgot Your Floaties is more of a Magic Man episode than a Betty episode. She's barely in King's Ransom, and she only appears as an AI in Broca's Crown. We just haven't gotten to spend enough time with Betty, at least not up to this point in the series. Thankfully, we are about to see a major shakeup in the way in which the show treats Betty starting season 9. But before we move on to that, I have a bit of an intermission for you all. Just to hammer home how much missed potential there is with Betty, I want to take the time to discuss my top 4 characters that I wish Betty had interacted with more. And this is across the entire series, not just up to the point that we're currently at. These characters will be ranked in terms of how much potential I think they had for more interactions with Betty. At number 4, we have Princess Bubblegum. PB and Betty obviously share a lot of parallels with each other. They're both dorky science girls, they're both a little quirky and antisocial, and they're both characters that Simon feels a strong infatuation for. So it's such a bummer to me that we never see the two interact. I could easily see a fun episode about the two of them doing experiments on Ice King to try and make him Simon again. Hell, you can contrast Magic Betty with PB's complete and utter hatred of magic. Have some fun with it. PB and Betty are 2 of my favorite characters, so it's a real shame we never got this. At number 3, we have Finn. Now, Finn and Betty get a fair amount of time to interact with each other, most notably in the Elements miniseries and Temple of Mars. I think my issue is that most of Finn's major interactions with Betty come after the Islands miniseries. After Finn has already received closure with the humans. Finn and Betty really should have interacted more prior to Islands. Even just 1 or 2 lines from Finn where he asks her about human culture or comments on the fact that she is another human would have gone a long way, though ideally they would have had at least a full episode together. For a good chunk of Adventure Time, Finn and Betty are 2 of the only human characters, and it's a little lame that the show never acknowledged that. At number 2, we have Magic/Normal Man. As I said before, I really do wish we got at least 1 more Betty and Magic Man episode before You Forgot Your Floaties. I like a lot of their dialogue in that episode, I just wish there was more of it. They have a fun dynamic. These 2 people who lost the loves of their lives to magical forces, and whose character arcs end up going in opposite trajectories. Speaking of which, I really wish we got more Betty and Normal Man too. Either something in between Elements and Temple of Mars, or an episode between Temple of Mars and Come Along With Me. It'd be interesting to see how these 2 interact now that their roles on the show have swapped. Like Betty, Magic Man is another character that the show severely underused, so I think pairing the 2 up would have done both of them a favor. And at number 1, we have Marceline. This one actually drives me up a wall. Do y'all want to know how many times Betty and Marceline interact throughout the entirety of Adventure Time? 0. Absolutely none. Oh, sure, they appear on screen together a few times, but not once have the 2 ever had any direct dialogue with each other, which is absolutely insane to me. Betty and Marceline are 2 of the only characters in the show who knew Simon before he went full Ice King. In fact, dare I say it, the lack of Marcy and Betty interactions might be the biggest piece of missed potential throughout the entirety of Adventure Time. There's so much the show could have done with Marcy and Betty, even just for 1 episode. They could have explored how Marceline views Betty. I mean, Simon definitely told Marceline stories about him and Betty during their time together. Maybe she has a similar romanticized view of their relationship that Simon himself has. You can also do something with the fact that these 2 characters' relationships with Simon go in exact opposite directions. Whereas Marceline grew to accept the Ice King for who he is, Betty drove herself mad with her obsession for who he used to be. Maybe Marcy turns against Betty due to her trying to quote-unquote fit Simon. Or maybe Marcy tries to show Betty that Ice King isn't so bad. There was so much potential for an interesting dynamic between these two characters, and it baffles me that the show squandered it. But with that intermission out of the way, it is now time to discuss Betty's role in the Elements miniseries. This set of episodes marks a few pretty significant changes in Betty's character, all of which, in my opinion, are positive. The first significant thing that Elements does is just increasing Betty's overall screen time, with her having a major role in the miniseries. Now, of course, it's not like she gets a ton to do in every episode. Her most significant are Bespoken 4, Hero Heart, and Skyhooks 2. But even just getting at least one scene with her per episode really goes a long way in making us like Betty and care about her storyline. And I really like Betty's arc in Elements, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. For now, let's talk about Betty's voice, as Elements marks the debut of Felicia Day as Betty, taking over from Lena Dunham. I think Lena Dunham did a fine enough job as Betty. She certainly wasn't bad as Betty, and she had some good line reads. I really love her scream at the end of You Forgot Your Floaties, for example. But Felicia Day is so much better. Easily my favorite recast of the entire series. She just brings so much more life and energy to the character. And that brings us to the last major change that Elements made for Betty, as now that she has magic, madness, and sadness, she is way more unhinged than she was beforehand. She's way more prone to laughing maniacally or just making strange comments, and it's so much fun. And it makes for a perfect parallel to Simon, who similarly went crazy due to being inflicted by magic and losing Betty. But let's talk about Betty's arc in Elements. The basic idea of her storyline here is that this is Betty attempting to love Ice King for who he is and stop trying to make him someone he used to be. Essentially, her attempt to do what Marceline did back in I Remember You. And what's so tragic about it is that it almost works. There are quite a few moments throughout Elements where Betty seems to genuinely enjoy Ice King's company. It's like Betty becoming just as crazy as Ice King kinda evened things out for the two of them. They could have spent the rest of their lives like this and probably would have been happy together. But as we all know, Ice King will never be enough for Betty. Now, it's entirely possible, likely even, that Betty was planning on betraying Finn the entire time. However, I think it was this moment in Hero Heart that really pushed Betty into doing what she did. Here's this moment of Ice King giving this big, inspirational speech that sounds almost exactly like something Simon would say, only for him to immediately pivot into a very Ice King-y line about mashed potatoes. Like, the fact that the Simon in him so regularly comes out is almost what makes things worse for Betty. It's like a constant reminder of the person Simon used to be, the life that Betty used to have. So Betty makes a desperate gambit to rewrite history and get that old life back. This is maybe the most unhinged thing Betty has ever done, as it not only would prevent Ice King from existing, but could potentially erase everyone we know and knew. Betty herself even seems to be aware of this, convincing herself that she's doing the right thing. It's a desperate attempt from Betty to get her old life back when she's just too far gone at this point. And it completely overrides Simon's own autonomy. Thankfully, Betty's plan does not work, and she's sent to Mars, presumably by Prismo, where we don't pick up on her again until Season 10's Temple of Mars. As it turns out, Normal Man has been attempting to cure Betty of her obsession with Simon by making her fill a hole with sand grain by grain. How this is meant to cure her, I have no idea. Betty ends up joining Finn and Jermaine on their quest to find the space telemetry capsule and use it to locate Jake. Now, obviously Betty gets a pretty big moment near the end of this episode, but before we get to that, I actually want to talk about the puzzle right beforehand first. This unfixable math problem she tries to solve is a pretty obvious metaphor for Betty's attempt to cure Simon. Made even more on the nose by the fact that Ice Thane is the one who keeps messing with the problem. In both cases, the only way to solve the problem is to stop trying to fix it. But obviously, the most significant moment in this episode happens right after, where for the first and really only time in the series, we see Betty before she met Simon. This younger, bright-eyed version of Betty who's ready to go on her trip to Australia. But as we learn from present-day Betty, she never ended up going on that trip, as she met Simon the very next day. Much like the library note, this trip that Betty was planning on going on will be relevant again later on in this video. Betty seems to make a bit of a breakthrough in this episode, as she confesses that she's dedicated so much of her life to Simon that she doesn't feel like a full person anymore. Betty changes the date of her flight to prevent her younger self from ever meeting Simon to begin with. For a moment, the show convinces us that Betty has taken a positive step in moving on from Simon, only for her to pull the rug out from under us and reveal that she took away the exact opposite lesson, that she needs to work even harder if she wants to get Simon back. I've always really loved the subversion, feels super in character for Betty, just too damn stubborn to accept the obvious lesson presented to her. And that takes us to Come Along With Me, the climax in Betty's story, in which she and Normal Man summon Golb as a last-ditch effort to get Simon back. As Ice King confronts Betty in this episode, we get a moment pretty similar to the one I discussed in Hero Heart, in which Ice King sings to her in a way that reminds her of Simon. In fact, it's entirely possible that it reminded Betty of their song, until it's revealed to her that this was actually a song about Fiona and Cake. One last reminder of the person that Betty's lost. And this directly leads to the two being consumed by Golb, in which Ice King is transformed back into Simon and he and Betty are reunited. For all intents and purposes, Betty won. She finally got Simon back. But it all comes at a sacrifice, as Betty stays behind to make one last wish to keep Simon safe, resulting in her fusing with Golb, leaving Simon alone in Ooh. And this bittersweet ending was the one that we had for 5 years, not that I had any issues with it. Betty did some truly unhinged things in the pursuit of getting Simon back. So I think it's only appropriate that her arc ends with her and Simon permanently separated right after reuniting. The show ending with Simon and Betty together would have only validated her codependency on him. But it does leave the question of what happens to Simon. How does he navigate this world full of magic after he's lost all of his? As we find out in the first season of Fiona and Cake, the answer is poorly. Very, very poorly. In the 12 years that have passed since Come Along With Me, Simon has essentially become Betty, too obsessed with his past to enjoy his present. He's become a depressed alcoholic, arguably in a worse state than Ice King was at the start of the original series. But through his adventure with Fiona and Cake, he learns to open up a bit more, particularly with Fiona. And in Jerry, my favorite episode of the entire franchise, Simon tells Fiona the story about how he and Betty fell in love. I really love the decision to include Simon and Betty flashbacks in the first place, as it's probably something we should have had for a while now. The only Simon and Betty flashback we had in the original series was this one in Come Along With Me. I obviously already cared about Simon and Betty as individual characters, but getting this extra bit of context makes me care so much more about their relationship. It retroactively makes Betty's entire character arc in the original series so much more tragic, because now we know what kind of relationship she wanted to get back so bad. And as far as Betty's characterization in these flashbacks go, I really love how much of a dork they made her here. Obviously, Betty's nerdiness was always an aspect of her character. She was a graduate student after all, but they really emphasize it a lot more here, the way she just geeks out over Simon's work. And that's one of the first things we learn about Simon and Betty's relationship through these flashbacks, that Betty was a fan of Simon's work prior to even meeting him. Not that Simon would ever knowingly take advantage of this, but it does set up a bit of a power dynamic between him and Betty. The fact that Betty has had this almost parasocial relationship with Simon. And throughout the flashbacks, we constantly see Betty making sacrifices for Simon. Remember that trip Betty wanted to go on from Temple of Mars? Well, it turns out she put it off so that she could help Simon hunt for the Enchiridion. Then, once they find the Enchiridion, she lets Simon take all the credit for it. Remember that note Simon mentioned and broke his crown? Well, turns out it was that very note that convinced Simon to stop Betty from getting on the bus to the Outback. And as we learn in Temple of Mars, Betty never ended up going on that trip. And of course, this is to say nothing of all the sacrifices Betty made for Simon over the course of the original show. And I am in no way saying that Simon and Betty's relationship was toxic. Simon obviously didn't make Betty do any of this. But he and Betty were both viewing the relationship through rose-tinted glasses, unable to see the ways in which Betty was suffocating. Hell, even Everything in You, their beautiful love song, was originally a song that just Betty was listening to before it was hers and Simon's. Simon and Betty did genuinely love each other, that much is true. But just because their love for each other was mutual does not mean they were on equal footing. And this is what Simon has to learn at the end of the season, to finally put down the rose-tinted glasses and view the relationship for what it is. Something that is absolutely beautiful and worthy of being cherished, but also hurt both him and Betty. In the 12 years she spent as Golb, Betty probably had a lot of time to reflect on her relationship with Simon. And hopefully after getting this bit of closure, Simon will get the chance to do the same. There's definitely been a lot of criticism thrown at Cheers for supposedly depicting Simon as selfish and his relationship with Betty as toxic. I think this criticism is extremely overblown. Not only because the show makes it explicitly clear that this wasn't completely Simon's fault and that he was just ignorant to Betty's sacrifices, but also because the entire point of Simon learning this is so that he doesn't make the same mistakes that Betty made. So that he doesn't sacrifice his own life and well-being for the sake of others. So that he could learn to love and value himself with or without Betty in his life. All things that Betty just wasn't able to do. At least, not while she was mortal. I've seen a lot of people speculate that Betty will be in Season 2 of Fiona and Cake, mostly due to this blue light that encompasses Betty at the end of Season 1. To be honest, I don't know what this means, but I don't think Betty is gonna be in Season 2. And that's mostly because her story is over. And really, it's been over since Come Along With Me, as her role in Fiona and Cake mostly serves as to give Simon closure to his story. Like, obviously there are things that I wish the show did with her when it had the chance, but I don't think anything can be done about that now. And I know I said something very similar to this about the Lich in the past, but I feel it even stronger with Betty, because unlike the Lich, who the show could hypothetically bring back as much as it wants, Betty is a character whose arc just feels so complete to me. What left is there even to do with her? And besides, with Huntress Wizard taking Simon's spot and the season being less multiverse heavy, what role would Betty even have in Season 2? Maybe a flashback to when she was studying Huntress Wizard? I don't know. No, like Simon, I think it's time we all move on from Betty, learn to live without her, but still cherish the memories that we hold of her. Cheers to you, Betty Grof, one of the greatest characters with one of the greatest arcs in all of Adventure Time. Squill out.